Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of History of Chivalry and the Crusades by G.P.R. James. Chapter 6.
One of the most unfortunate events which occurred to the Crusaders in their march was their stay at Constantinople, for it was the remote but certain cause of many other evils. The jealousies and differences raised up among them by the intriguing spirit of Alexius were never entirely done away. And besides this, the intervention of petty motives, long discussions, and schemes of individual aggrandizement chilled the fervor of zeal, and thus weighed down the most energetic spring of the enterprise. Enthusiasm will conquer difficulties, confront danger and death, and change the very nature of the circumstances in which it is placed, to encouragement and hope. But it will not bear to be mingled with less elevated feelings and considerations. The common ambitions and passions of life, cold reasonings and thoughtful debates deaden it and put it out, and amid the intrigues of interest or the speculations of selfishness, it is extinguished like a flame in the foul air of a vault. A great deal of the enthusiasm of the crusade died away amid the bickerings of Constantinople, and even the cowardly effeminacy of the Greeks proved in some degree contagious. For the army of the Count of Toulouse, we find, had at one time nearly disbanded itself. The luxury of the most luxurious court of Europe, too, was not without its effect upon the Crusaders, and the memory of the delights of the imperial city was more likely to afford subjects of disadvantageous comparisons when opposed to the hardships of Palestine than the remembrance of the turbulent and governless realm from which they had first begun their march. The greatest misfortune of all, however, the cause of many of their vices, and almost all their miseries, was the want of one acknowledged leader whom it would have been treason to disobey. Each chief was his own king, but he was not the king of even those who served under him. Many who had followed his banner to the field were nearly his equals in power, and it was only over his immediate vassals that he had any but conditional right of command. In respect to his vassals themselves, this right was much affected by circumstances, and over the chiefs around him he had no control whatever. Thus, unity of design was never to be obtained, and discord, the fatal stumbling block of all great undertakings, was always ready in the way whenever the folly, the passions, or the selfishness of any individual leader chose to dash upon it the hopes of himself and his companions. Nevertheless, during the siege of Nice, which was the first undertaking of the Crusaders, a considerable degree of harmony seems to have prevailed among the leaders. Each, it is true, conducted his part of the attack according to his own principles, but each seemed happy to assist the other, and we hear of no wrangling for idle punctilios. The morals, too, of the troops were hitherto pure, reaching a much higher point of virtue, indeed, than might have been anticipated from the great mixture of classes. I do not mean to say that they were free from vice, or were exempt from the follies of their nature or their age, but the noble and dignified manner in which the chiefs of the crusade, and the people in general, bore the conduct of Alexius, mentioned hereafter, would lead me to believe that they had preserved a considerable share of purity and singleness of heart. The first body of the Crusaders which reached the city of Nice was that led by Godfrey of Bouillon. He was not alone, however, being accompanied by Hugh, Count of Vermandois. And very shortly after, the troops of Robert of Flanders and Beaumont of Tarentum arrived and took up their position on the northern side, while those of Godfrey had marked their camp towards the east. The Count of Toulouse and the Bishop of Puy followed and sat down before the southern side, leaving the west open for the Duke of Normandy, who was expected from day to day. This city, the capital of the Kingdom of Roum, was occupied by the Seljukian Turks and strongly defended by a solid wall, flanked by 350 towers. It was situated in the midst of a fertile plain, and the waters of the lake Ascanius, to the west, gave it a facility of communication with a large extent of country. The army of the Crusaders, after the arrival of the Count of Toulouse, waited not the coming of Robert of Normandy, but began the siege in form. Their forces were already immense, and after the junction of Peter the Hermit with the ruins of his multitude, and the Duke of Normandy with his powerful army, the amount of the fighting men is said to have been 600,000, without comprising those who did not carry arms. The number of knights is stated to have reached nearly 200,000, which left a fair proportion of inferior soldiers. The general disposition of the troops had been made before the arrival of the Count of Toulouse, and he marched his division towards the spot assigned him on the Sunday after Ascension Day. His coming, however, was destined to be signalized by the first regular battle between the Turks and their Christian invaders. Solomon, or Kilij Aslan, the Sultan of Roum, on the approach of the Crusaders, had left his capital defended by a strong garrison, and traveling through his dominions, hastened in every direction the levies of his subjects. He soon collected a considerable body of horse, and leading them to the mountains which overlooked the plain of Nice, he sent down 2 messengers to the city to concert with the governor a double attack upon the camp of the Christians. The messengers fell into the hands of the outposts of Godfrey. One was killed on the spot, and the other, under the fear of death, betrayed the secrets of the Sultan, giving at the same time an exaggerated account of his forces. Information of Solomon's approach was instantly sent to Raymond of Toulouse, who was advancing from Nicomedia, and by a night march he succeeded in joining the army of the Cross in time. Scarcely had he taken up his position when the Moslems began to descend from the mountains, clad like the Christians in steel, and borne by horses fleet as the wind. Divided into 2 bodies, the one attacked the wearied troops of the Count of Toulouse, seeking to force its way into the city, while the other fell upon the quarters of Godfrey of Bouillon. Doubtless Solomon thought to meet, in the immense multitude before him, a wild and undisciplined crowd, like that of Peter the Hermit. But he soon found bitterly his mistake. The Crusaders received him everywhere with chivalric valor, repulsed him on all points, became in turn the assailants, and the plain round Nice grew one general scene of conflict. The charging of the cavalry, the ringing of the lances and the swords upon shields and corslets, the battle cries of the Christians and the tekbir of the Turks, the shouts, the screams, the groans rose up, we are told, in a roar horrible to hear. At length, finding that the sally he had expected was not made, Solomon retreated to the mountains, but it was only to repeat the attempt the following day. In this, although the besieged now comprehended his intention and issued forth upon the Christians on the one side, while he attacked them on the other, he was not more fortunate than before. He was again repelled with great loss, owning his astonishment at the lion-like courage of the Christian leaders, who with 1,000 lances would often charge and put to flight 20 times the number of Turkish horsemen. According to a barbarous custom prevalent at that time, and which even descended to a much later period, the Crusaders hewed off the heads of the fallen Moslems and cast many of them into the city. Others were sent to Constantinople in token of victory, and Alexius, as a sign of gratitude and rejoicing, instantly dispatched large presents to the principal chiefs of the crusade, with great quantities of provisions for the army, which had long been straitened to a fearful degree. After the defeat of Solomon, the siege was pressed with renewed vigor, and battering rams, catapults, and mangonels were plied incessantly against the walls, while movable towers of wood, called beffrois, filled with armed men, were rolled close to the fortifications, for the purpose of carrying on the fight hand-to-hand with the enemy, and of endeavoring to effect a lodgment on the battlements. In the meanwhile, the plains round Nice offered a spectacle of the most extraordinary brilliancy. The glittering arms of the knights, their painted shields and fluttering pennons, the embroidered banners of the barons, their splendid coats of arms and magnificent mantles, the gorgeous robes of the Latin priests, who were present in immense numbers, and the animated multitude of bowmen and foot soldiers, mingled with thousands of that most beautiful of beasts, the horse, all spread out in the unclouded brightness of an Asiatic sky, formed as shining and extraordinary a scene as the eye could look upon. Not frightened, however, by the terrific splendor that surrounded them, the Turks continued to defend their battlements with persevering valor. Every attack of the Christians was met with dauntless intrepidity, and every labored attempt to sap the wall or its towers was frustrated with unwearied assiduity. Those who approached near were either slain by poisoned arrows or crushed under immense stones, and the moment anyone was killed at the foot of the wall. It was horrible to see the Turks, says an eyewitness, seize upon the body with iron hooks let down from above, and lifting it up through the airstrip it completely, and then cast it out from the city. Innumerable artifices were resorted to by the assailants to force their way into the town, and none of the chiefs seem to have been more active and ingenious than the Count of Toulouse, who once succeeded in undermining a tower and casting it to the ground. Before this work was concluded, however, night had fallen over the army, and ere the next morning, the laborious activity of the Turks had repaired the damage which their wall had suffered. Two of the principal German barons also contrived a machine of wood to which they gave the name of the Fox. It was capable of containing 20 knights and was secured by its immense solidity from all the efforts of the enemy. When this was completed, a vast multitude began to push it towards the part of the curtain which they intended to sap, but the inequality of the ground and the great weight of the machine itself caused some of the joints to give way, when the whole fabric fell to pieces, crushing under its ruins the unhappy knights within. The arrival of Robert of Normandy brought a vast accession of strength to the besiegers, notwithstanding which, during the remainder of the siege of Nice, the immense numbers of the Crusaders did not produce that scarcity of provision which ultimately fell upon them. For Alexius, interested more than any one in the capture of the city, took care, after the first few days, that the supplies should be ample and unremitted. Nevertheless, the courage of the garrison did not at all decrease, and for 5 weeks they still continued to return the assailants combat for combat, the whole day being consumed in a storm of arrows from the bows and arbalists, and of stones from the catapults and mangonels. Numerous instances of extraordinary personal courage shown on both sides are of course recorded, and each different historian has his own hero, whose deeds are lauded to the sky. One Turk in particular signalized himself by an immense slaughter of the Crusaders, showing himself exposed upon the battlements and plying his terrible bow, which winged death in every direction. The Christians became so fearful of him that most imaginative passion, terror, began to invest him with some supernatural defense. The best aimed arrows proved totally ineffectual, and reports spread rapidly that he might be seen, still sending destruction around from his hand, while 20 shafts, each carrying the fate of a common mortal, were sticking unheeded in his flesh. Godfrey of Bouillon, to end the panic that this man occasioned, at length took a crossbow himself, though that machine was considered but a fit weapon for a yeoman, and directing the quarry with a steadier hand than those which had before aimed at the Turkish archer, he sent the missile directly to his heart. A multitude of the noblest crusaders had now fallen before the bows of the enemy, and many more had yielded to the effects of a climate totally different from their own. Thus, says one of the followers of the cross, nothing was to be seen on the highways, in the woods, and the fields, but a crowd of tombs where our brethren had been buried. At last, the leaders perceived the existence of a circumstance, their neglect of which, in the very first instance, showed how much the art of warfare was then in its infancy. One evening, after a fierce assault, the soldiers stationed near the water, who, in common with the rest of the host, usually rested from the labors of the siege during the night, suddenly perceived boats upon the lake Ascanius, and it immediately became evident that the Turks received every kind of supply by this easy means of communication. As soon as this was discovered, various vessels were brought from Constantinople, and being drawn to the lake over a narrow neck of land which separated it from the sea, were filled with imperial archers, and the blockade of the town was thus rendered absolute. This was executed during the night, and all hope abandoned the Turks from the next morning, when they beheld that which had proved their great resource suddenly cut off. The Crusaders now hoped to force the city to surrender at discretion, and their expectations of such an event were much raised by the fact of the Sultaness, the wife of Solomon, who had hitherto courageously undergone all the miseries and dangers of a siege, being taken in endeavoring to make her escape by the lake. By this time the besieged had determined to surrender. But Alexius had taken care to send with the army of the cross an officer on whose art and fidelity he could depend, to secure for the imperial crown a city which he would probably have rather seen still under the dominion of the Turks than in the hands of the Latins. This man's name was Tatitius, or, according to the Crusaders' corruption, Tatin. His face was dreadfully mutilated, and his mind seems to have been as horrible as his countenance. What communication he kept up within the town it is difficult to discover, and how this communication was concealed from the Latins is hardly known, but probably it took place, as Mills conjectures, by means of the lake and the Greek vessels which now covered it. Certain it is that the Turks entered into a private treaty with the emissary of Alexius, who granted them the most advantageous terms, securing to them not only life, but immunity and protection. It had been covenanted beforehand between the emperor and the Crusaders that on the fall of the city it should be resigned to Alexius, who promised to give up to the troops all the riches it contained, and to found there a monastery and an hospital for pilgrims under the superintendence of the Latins. Not contented with this, or doubting the faith of his allies, he took the means I have stated to secure possession. Suddenly, the imperial ensigns appeared upon the walls of Nice, when the host of the crusade was just rushing to the attack in the full confidence of victory. It was now found that the people of the city had surrendered privately to Alexius and had admitted his troops within the walls, but it required the greatest efforts of the leaders of the crusade, although disgusted with this treachery themselves, to quiet their forces and reconcile them to the perfidy of their base ally. On the part of the Christians, the wife and children of Kilij Aslan, who had fallen into their hands, were delivered to the Turks, and at the same time, all those prisoners which had been taken by Solomon on the defeat of Gautier Sansavoir were restored to liberty. So little, however, did Alexius keep his treaty with the Crusaders, that instead of yielding to them the whole plunder of Nice, he contented himself with distributing some rich presents to the chiefs and some money to the poor of the army, and suffered them, thus dissatisfied and injured, to raise their camp and march on towards Jerusalem, without permitting them to set foot within the city they had conquered. The army of the Cross waited no time under the walls of Nice, but as soon as the principal leaders had returned from Pelicanum, whither they had gone once more to confer with Alexius, it began its march. At the end of the second day, the forces of the different chiefs were accidentally separated, Bohemond and the Duke of Normandy taking a path considerably to the left of that, followed by Godfrey and the rest of the host. They proceeded on their way, notwithstanding, knowing that they could not be very far from the principal body, and towards night pitched their camp in the valley of Gorgon, in the midst of some rich meadows and near a running stream. Their situation was, nevertheless, not near so desirable as they imagined, for Solomon, who during the siege of Nice had made the most immense efforts for the purpose of relieving that city, now that it had fallen, hung with the whole of his force, to the amount of nearly 200,000 men, upon the left flank of the army of the Crusaders, concealing his own evolutions by his perfect knowledge of the country, and watching those of his enemies with the keen anxiety of a falcon hovering over her prey. No sooner had the separation we have mentioned taken place in the host of the Cross than the Sultan hastened his march to overtake the army of Bohemond, which was infinitely the weaker of the two divisions. Accustomed to every sort of rapid movement, Solomon soon came up with the forces of the Prince of Tarentum and the Duke of Normandy. The Crusaders had been from time to time warned, during the preceding day, that an enemy was in the neighborhood, by the sight of scattered parties of Arabs hovering round their army. They nevertheless encamped by the side of a beautiful stream that, flowing on through the rich valley in which they were advancing, proceeded to join itself to the waters of the Sangarius. Here, they passed the night in repose, taking merely the precaution of throwing out sentinels to the banks of the stream. Early the next morning, Bohemond and Robert again commenced their march, and had advanced some way when the immense army of Solomon began to appear upon the hills. Bohemond instantly sent off messengers to Godfrey of Bouillon and the rest of his noble companions, of whose proximity he had now become aware, and gave orders for drawing up his forces, for pitching the tents, and for making a rampart of the wagons and baggage for the defense of the sick and the weak from the arrows of the Turks. In the meanwhile, turning to his knights and men at arms, he addressed them with the brief eloquence of courage. "Remember the duties of your calling," he exclaimed. "Behold the peril in which you are placed. Charge boldly to meet the infidels. Defend your honor and your lives." While he spoke, the Turks rushed down to the battle with terrific cries, which, mingling with the tramp of 200,000 horse and the ringing of their armor, together with the trumpets of the Christian host and the shouts of the chiefs and the heralds, raised so fearful a din that no one could hear another speak among the followers of the cross. The army of Bohemond, hastily drawn up, presented a mingled front of horse and foot soldiers and pilgrims, some but half-armed, some not armed at all, while the Turks came down in one torrent of cavalry. The immense numbers which it contained, all blazing with glittering arms, and provided with bows of horn and scimitars, dazzled and dismayed the troops of the Christians. As the infidels approached, the European chivalry dropped the points of their long lances and prepared to hurl back their foes, as was their wont, by the heavy and decided charge which proved always so effective. But suddenly, each Moslem raised his bow even as he galloped forward. A thick cloud seemed to come over the sun, and then 200,000 arrows dropping at once among the Crusaders, a multitude of men and horses were instantly stretched upon the plain. Before the Christians could rally from the surprise, a second flight of arrows followed the first, doing dreadful execution among the foot soldiers and the steeds of the knights. But now Tancred and Bohemond led on their troops to the charge and spurred their horses into the midst of the enemy. The Turks, as was their habit, yielded ground on every side, avoiding, by the swiftness of their chargers, the lances and the swords of the Christians, and like the Parthians of old, continuing their fearful archery even as they fled. Vain were all the efforts of the European chivalry, though, throwing away their useless spears, they endeavored to reach the Turks with their swords. But now, in turn, the swarming multitudes of their foes, pouring down fresh from the mountains on every side, no longer retreated, but pressed closer and closer upon them. And as each adversary fell beneath the vigorous blows of the knights, new foes started up to meet them. In the meanwhile, thick and fast was mown the flower of the Christian army. The brother of Tancred, famed alike for his beauty and his courage, was slain before the eyes of his relation. Tancred himself, surrounded by 1,000 enemies, fought as if fate had put the weapon in his hands, but fought in vain. Bohemond, with all his efforts, could scarcely extricate his gallant cousin from the torrent of adversaries in the midst of which he struggled. And even then, it was with the loss of the banner of Otranto, borne back by the growing multitude that pressed upon them. The knights gave way before the Saracens, and were driven struggling upon the very pikes of the foot soldiers that were advancing to their support. At the same time, Solomon, whose numbers gave him the means of surrounding the army of the Crusaders, directed several large bodies of his cavalry through some marshes to the rear of the Christians. And in a moment the camp of Beaumont was invaded and deluged with the blood of the old, the women, and the helpless. Robert of Normandy, however, who had commanded the reserve, now beholding the flight of his allies, roused all the courage of his heart, and uncovering his head in the midst of the fray, shouted forth his battle cry of, "Normandy! Normandy! Whither fly you, Beaumont?" he exclaimed. "Your Apulia is afar. Where go you, Tancred? Otranto is not near you. Turn! Turn upon the enemy. God wills it. God wills it." And seizing his banner, he spurred on with his followers against the Turks, drove them back, rallied the cavalry, and restored order and regularity to the defense. Bohemond, in the meanwhile, had turned his arms towards the camp, and the Turks had retreated from that quarter of the field, bearing with them all that was valuable and a considerable number of prisoners. The army of the Crusade was now concentrated on one spot, while that of the Turks, surrounding it on all sides, gave it not a moment's repose. Soldier fell beside soldier, knight beside knight. Fatigue and thirst rendered those that remained little capable of defense, and the dust and the hot sun made many of the wounds mortal, which otherwise would have been slight in comparison. In this conjuncture, the women that remained proved infinitely serviceable, bringing to the troops water from the river, and by prayers and exhortations encouraging them to the fight. Thus lasted the battle for many hours, when first a cloud of dust, rising from behind the hills, announced that some new combatants were hurrying to the field. Then rose above the slope banner, and pennon, and lance, and glittering arms, while the red cross, fluttering on the wind, brought hope and joy to the sinking hearts of the Crusaders, and terror and dismay to the victorious Turks. In scattered bands, spurring on their horses as for life, came the chivalry of the West to the aid of their brother Christians. None waited for the others, but each hastened to the fight as the fleetness of his charger would permit, and rank after rank, troop after troop, banner followed by banner, and spear glittering after spear, came rushing over the mountains to the valley of the battle. "God wills it! God wills it!" echoed from hill to hill. Robert of Normandy shouted his war cry, Beaumont, with renewed hope, couched his lance, and Tancred rushed upon the slayers of his brother. At the same time, Godfrey of Bouillon arrayed his army as they came up, and with leveled lances drove down upon the Turks. Hugh of Vermandois attacked them on the flank, and Raymond of Toulouse, with the warlike Bishop of Puy, soon increased the forces of the cross. The Turks still made great and valorous efforts to maintain the superiority they had gained, but the charge of the Latin chivalry was irresistible. The infidels were driven back, compelled to fly in disorder, and pursued over the mountains by the victorious Crusaders. In the hills the Christians, who followed hard upon their course, discovered the camp of the Saracens, where immense booty, both in gold and provisions, became the recompense of their exertions. Here, also, they found all the prisoners who had been taken in the first part of the battle, and a great number of beasts of burthen, of which they were themselves in great need. Among the rest was a multitude of camels, an animal which few of the Franks had ever seen before. These were all brought to the Christian encampment, and rejoicing succeeded the fatigues and horrors of the day. The loss of the Crusaders, after so long and severe a battle, if we can depend upon the account generally given, was very much less than might have been anticipated. Only 4,000 men are supposed to have fallen on the part of the Christians. These were principally also of the inferior classes, who, unprotected by the armor which defended the persons of the knights, were fully exposed to the arrows of the Turks. 3 men of great note, among the champions of the cross, were added to this list of killed: William, the brother of Tancred, Geoffrey of Mount Scabius, and Robert of Paris, whose conduct at the court of Alexius we have before mentioned. The loss on the part of the Turks was infinitely more considerable, and thus, at the close of the Battle of Doryloeum, the Christian leaders found that they had marked their progress towards the Holy Land by a great and decisive victory. The crusading armies now paused for several days, enjoying the repose and comfort which the spot afforded, and which their exhausted troops so much required. The wounds of the soldiers who had suffered in the late battle were thus in some degree healed, and the abundance of provisions the enemy had left behind served to renovate the strength and raise up the hopes and enthusiasm of the Christians. In the meanwhile, the Turks, who had survived their defeat at Doryloeum, spread themselves in large bands over the country, and, pretending to have totally overcome the Latins, forced themselves into the cities, destroying and wasting everything in their way. The Christians thus, in their march through Phrygia, had to cross a large tract which had been completely ravaged by the enemy. With their usual improvidence, they had exhausted the provisions they had found in their adversaries' camp, and ignorant of the country, they had provided themselves with no water, so that they had to encounter all the heat of the solstitial days of a Phrygian climate, without a drop of liquid to allay their burning thirst. Men and horses fell by thousands in the way, and the women, parched with drought and dying with fatigue, forgot delicacy, feeling, and even the ties of human nature, rolled prostrate on the ground with the agony of thirst, offered their naked bosoms to the swords of the soldiers, and prayed for death, or threw down their newborn children in the track of the army and abandoned them to a slow and miserable fate. The most terrible mortality prevailed among the beasts of burden, so that the animals accustomed to bear the baggage of the host, having nearly all died by the way, Dogs and oxen and even hogs are said to have been loaded with the lighter articles of necessity, while an immense quantity of luggage was cast away on the road. Many falcons and dogs, a part of knightly equipage never forgotten, had been brought from Europe to Asia, but the dogs, spreading their nostrils in vain to the hot wind for the least breath of moisture, left the long accustomed hand that they were wont to love, and straying through the desolate land, died among the mountains, while the clear eye of the noble falcon withered under the fiery sky, which nothing but a vulture could endure. And, after long privation, he dropped from the glove that held him. At length, water was discovered, and the whole army rushed forward to the river. Their intemperate eagerness rendered the means of relief nearly as destructive as the thirst which they had endured, and many were added to the victims of that horrible march by their own imprudent indulgence in the cool blessing that they had found at last. The country now had changed its aspect, and nothing presented itself but splendid fertility till the host of the crusade reached the city of Antiochetta, where, surrounded by rivulets and forests and rich pastures, they pitched their tents, determined to enjoy the earthly paradise that spread around them. Some of the warriors, however, whose energetic spirit no fatigues could daunt or subdue, soon tired of the idle sweets of Antiochetta and voluntarily separated themselves from the army, seeking either renown or profit by detached enterprises. Tancred, on the one hand, with the Prince of Salernum and several other nobles, 500 knights, and a party of foot soldiers, set out from the army of Bohemond to explore the country and ascertain the strength of the enemies by which they were surrounded. Detaching himself, at the same time, from the division of Godfrey of Bouillon, Baldwin, the brother of that leader, joined Tancred with a somewhat superior force, actuated probably more by the hope of his own individual aggrandizement than by any purpose of serving the general cause of the crusade. After wandering for some time through the districts round Iconium and Heraclea, which the Turks had taken care to desolate beforehand, the two chieftains again separated, and Tancred, pursuing his way by Cilicia, came suddenly before Tarsus. The Turks, by whom that city was garrisoned, knowing that the greater part of the populace was opposed to them, surrendered almost immediately on the approach of the Christian leader. And while he encamped with his forces under the walls, waiting, according to stipulation, for the arrival of Bohemond, his banner was hoisted upon the towers of the town. Scarcely had this been done when Baldwin also appeared, and at first, the two armies, each conceiving the other to be an enemy, prepared to give one another battle. The mistake was soon discovered, and Tancred welcomed his comrade in arms to Tarsus. The feelings of Baldwin, however, were less chivalric than those of the noble chief of Otranto, and the banner of Tancred flying on the walls of Tarsus was an object that he could not long endure. After passing a day or two in apparent amity, he suddenly demanded possession of the city, declaring that as he led the superior force, he was entitled to command. Tancred scoffed at the absurd pretense, and both parties had nearly betaken themselves to arms. The noble moderation of the Italian leader brought about a temporary reconciliation. He agreed that the people of the city themselves should be referred to, and choose the chief to whom they would submit. This was accordingly done, and the inhabitants instantly fixed upon the knight to whom they had first surrendered. But Baldwin was yet unsatisfied, and after having made a proposal to sack and pillage the town, which was rejected with scorn and abhorrence by his more generous fellow soldier, he caballed with the citizens and the Turks till he won them to throw down Tancred's banner and yield themselves to him. Mortified, indignant, even enraged, the steady purpose of right within the bosom of the chief of Otranto maintained him still in that undeviating course of rectitude which he had always pursued, and resolved not to imbrue a sword drawn for honor and religion in the blood of his fellow Christians, he withdrew his forces from before Tarsus and turned his arms against Mamistra. The Turks here, more bold than those of the former city, beheld his approach unawed and held out the town for several days, till at length it fell by storm, and the victorious chief planted his banner on those walls with far more honorable glory than that which surrounded the standard of Baldwin at Tarsus. In the meanwhile, another body of crusaders, detached from the troops of Beaumont, arrived before the city in which Baldwin had established himself and demanded entrance, or at least assistance and provisions. Baldwin cruelly caused the gates to be shut upon them, and had it not been for the charitable care of some of the Christian inhabitants who let them down wine and food from the walls, they would have been left to expire of want. A fate hardly better awaited them. The Turks had still, by their capitulation, maintained possession of several of the towers of Tarsus, but fearful of the superior force of Baldwin, they sought but a fair opportunity to escape without pursuit. The very night that the detachment of which I have spoken above arrived, the Turks carried their intentions into effect, and finding a small body of Christians sleeping under the walls without defense, they made the massacre of the whole the first step in their flight. The soldiers of Baldwin and the citizens of Tarsus, who had together witnessed with indignation the barbarous conduct of the French chieftain, now rose in absolute revolt. Baldwin, however, having remained in concealment for a few days, contrived to pacify his followers and to overawe the city. After this, he joined himself to a band of piratical adventurers, who about that time arrived accidentally at Tarsus, and who, mingling their lust of prey with some dark and superstitious notions of religion, had turned their course towards the Holy Land, in the pleasant hope of serving both God and Mammon with the sword. With these Baldwin continued to ravage Cilicia, and at length approaching Mamistra, in which Tancred had established himself, he pitched his tents upon the immediate territory of that city. Tancred now gave way to his indignation, and issuing forth, though accompanied by very inferior forces, he attacked Baldwin's sword in hand, when a fierce engagement ensued between the two Christian armies. The struggle was severe but short. The superior numbers of the French prevailed, and Tancred was forced to retreat into the city. On one side, the Prince of Salernum was made prisoner by Baldwin, and on the other, Gilbert of Montclar was taken. But the next day, shame for their unchristian dissensions took possession of each chief. Peace was agreed upon. They embraced in sight of the two hosts. The captives were exchanged, and as usual, Satan got the credit of the dispute. Baldwin proceeded, after this, to join the main army, and left his piratical associates to aid Tancred in laying waste the country. During these events, the great body of the crusade had remained for some time at Antiochetta, where the people continued to acquire new health and strength in the enjoyment of that tranquility and abundance which had been so long withheld from them. Not so the chiefs, two of whom, and those of the most distinguished, had nearly, in this period of repose and peace, found that death which they had so often dared in the midst of battle and hardship. Godfrey of Bouillon, in delivering a pilgrim from the attack of a huge bear in the woods of Antiochetta, had almost fallen a victim to his chivalrous courage. He received so many wounds that even after having slain his ferocious adversary, he could not drag himself from the forest to the camp, and remained long and dangerously ill in consequence. At the same time, the Count of Toulouse was seized with a violent fever, which brought him to the brink of the grave. He was taken from his bed and laid upon the ground, as was customary among the pilgrims at the hour of death, that they might expire with all humility, and the Bishop of Orange administered the last sacraments of the Church. But a certain Count of Saxe, who accompanied the army, came to visit the leader of the Provençals, and told him that St. Giles, the patron saint of the Counts of Toulouse, had twice appeared to him in a dream, assuring him that so valuable a life should be spared to the Crusaders. Whether from the effect of that most excellent medicine, hope, or from a natural turn in his disease, the Count suddenly began to recover, and before long was sufficiently well to accompany the army in a litter. The chiefs of the crusade now directed their march towards Antioch, suffering not a little from the desolate state of the country, which, devastated on every side by the Turks, afforded no means of supplying the immense multitude that followed the standard of the cross. After passing Iconium and Heraclea, their fatigues were destined to increase rather than diminish. Their road now lay through uninhabited wilds, which Robert the Monk describes in language at once picturesque and terrific. They traveled, says he, with deplorable suffering through mountains where no path was to be found except the paths of reptiles and savage beasts, and where the passages afforded no more space than just sufficient to place one foot before the other, in tracks shut in between rocks and thorny bushes. The depths of the precipices seemed to sink down to the center of the earth, while the summits of the mountains appeared to rise up to the firmament. The knights and men-at-arms walked forward with uncertain steps, the armor being slung over their shoulders, and each of them acting as a foot soldier, for none dared mount his horse. Many would willingly have sold their helmets, their breastplates, or their shields, had they found any one to buy, and some, wearied out, cast down their arms to walk more lightly. No loaded horses could pass, and the men were obliged to carry the whole burdens. None could stop or sit down. None could aid his companion, except where the one who came behind might sometimes help the person before him, though those that preceded could hardly turn the head towards those that followed. Nevertheless, having traversed these horrible paths, or rather these pathless wildernesses, they arrived at length at the city named Marashia, the inhabitants of which received them with joy and respect. At Marash, the host was rejoined by Baldwin, whose wife died a few days before his arrival. His brother Godfrey, too, was still suffering from the effects of his combat with the wild beast, and all the chiefs of the crusade, indignant at his conduct at Tarsus, gave him but a chilling and gloomy reception. The spirit of individual aggrandizement was still the strongest passion in the breast of Baldwin, and the coldness of his companions in arms yielded him no great encouragement to stay and employ his efforts for the general object of the expedition, rather than for the purposes of his own selfish ambition. He very soon abandoned the rest of the chiefs, contriving to seduce 200 knights and a large party of foot soldiers to join him. And as his course was thenceforth separate from the rest of the Crusaders, I shall follow the example of G.P.R. and briefly trace it out till it falls again into the general stream of events. Accompanied by Pancrates, an Armenian, who painted in glowing colors the wealth of the provinces on the other side of the Euphrates, and the facility with which they might be conquered, he set out with the vague hope of plundering something and overcoming some one. He knew not well what or whom. However, his skill as a commander was certain to find matter on which to exercise itself, in a country possessed by an active enemy, while his rapacious propensities were very likely to be gratified in a rich and plentiful land, where the many were oppressed by the few. Turbessel and Ravendel fell immediately into his hands, and were at first placed under the command of his companion, Pancrates. But beginning to suspect that personage, he forced him to deliver up the cities by imprisonment, torture, and a threat of having him torn limb from limb. He then passed onward, crossed the Euphrates, and at the invitation of Thoros, sovereign of Edessa, entered that city to free it from the power of the Turks. Thoros, a weak and childless old man, was driven by the inhabitants who were terrified at their infidel neighbors and had no confidence in their feeble monarch to adopt the brother of Godfrey with all the curious ceremonies then practiced on such occasions. He passed his own shirt over Baldwin's shoulders, pressed him to his naked breast, and publicly declared him his son. The transactions that followed are very obscure, and as I have not been able to satisfy myself in regard to the share which Baldwin had in the tumults that succeeded and the death of Thoros, I will but state the facts, without attempting to trace them to secret causes, which are now hidden in the dark tabernacle of the past. Something we know. Baldwin was ambitious, unscrupulous, intriguing, cruel, and shortly after his arrival, the people of Edessa rose against their unhappy prince, slew him, and elected Baldwin in his place. It does not absolutely appear that Baldwin was the instigator of these riots, or the prompter of the death of Thoros, but it does appear that he did not exert himself as he might have done to put them down. That it was in his power to suppress them is evinced by the rapidity with which he reduced the Edessians to the most submissive obedience, immediately that the rank for which he had to contend was his own. He afterward proceeded to aggrandize his dominions by attacking various of the neighboring cities, and thus, in continual struggles, he passed his days till some time after his companions in arms had completed their conquest of the Holy Land. In the meanwhile, Tancred took possession of the whole country as far as the town of Alexandretta in the Gulf of Ajas, and the great army of the Crusade continued its march, throwing forward Robert of Flanders to seize on Artesia. The Mohammedan soldiery prepared to resist, but the Armenian inhabitants opened the gates to their Christian deliverers, and the infidels were massacred without mercy. On the news of this event, Bagazian, the commander of the Turkish garrison of Antioch, apparently not knowing the immediate proximity of the whole Christian force, endeavored to cut off, by stratagem, the small army of the Count of Flanders, who was accompanied by only 1,000 knights. For this purpose, the Turk advanced from Antioch, followed by nearly 20,000 horsemen, whom he placed in ambush in a plain near the city, while he himself, at the head of a petty detachment armed alone with bows of horn, advanced as if to reconnoitre the Christian troops. Robert of Flanders and his knights suffered themselves to be deceived, and charged the enemy, who fled before them. But, in a moment they were surrounded by immensely superior numbers, who, with terrific cries, rushed on to what appeared a certain victory. The gallantry and courage of the Christian warriors served to deliver them from the danger into which the excess of that very courage had brought them, and charging the Turks with vigor in one decided direction, they succeeded in cutting their way through and effecting their retreat to the city. Here, however, they were besieged by the enemy. But the arrival of Tancred, on his return from his victorious expedition, together with reinforcements from the main army, relieved them from the presence of the Turks, who retreated upon Antioch.
This concludes today's reading of History of Chivalry and the Crusades by G.P.R. James. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.